When we think about how we built machines that can learn, the answer isn't just found in lines of code or pieces of silicon. Nope, it's inside of us. It turns out the most complex object we know of, the human brain, was the ultimate blueprint for artificial intelligence. So, how in the world did we pull that off?
Well, it all kicks off with this absolutely mind-boggling number, 86 billion. That's how many neurons are firing away inside your skull as you listen to me right now. Every single one is a tiny processor in this massive, interconnected web. I mean, just try to wrap your head around that scale. It's almost impossible.
And seeing that staggering complexity, early pioneers started asking this really profound question. What if? What if we could actually reverse engineer nature's greatest masterpiece? Could we build a machine that learns and adapts using the very same principles that we do?
To figure that out, we're going to follow their journey. First, we'll look at the brain itself as the blueprint. Then, we'll see how they translated a single neuron into the first artificial brain cell, the perceptron. After that, we'll see how they added layers to build deeper intelligence, and check out AI that can actually see and remember. And finally, we'll talk about what all this means for the future.
All right, first up, the brain as blueprint. You see, before you can even think about building an artificial mind, you have to understand the biological one. And it turns out nature is one heck of an engineer. So the basic building block of the brain, the neuron, is actually pretty straightforward. It boils down to three main jobs. First, you've got its dendrites, which act like these little antennas pulling in signals from thousands of other neurons. Second, the cell body, the soma, gathers up all those incoming signals and kind of adds them up. And if that total signal is strong enough, boom, step 3 kicks in. The axon fires off a new signal to the next neuron. Receive, integrate, transmit. That's the loop, happening billions of times a second. But here's where the real magic happens. The brain actually learns by physically changing itself. It's a process called synaptic plasticity. Basically, the connections between neurons can get stronger or weaker depending on how often they're used. This right here, this is the secret sauce. It's the biological secret to learning and memory, and it's the one concept that AI researchers were desperate to copy.
So, how did they actually translate this biological blueprint into something a computer could use? We've got the design, but how do you build it? Well, this is a story of the very first artificial brain cell.
Now, this idea didn't just pop out of thin air. Back in 1949, a psychologist named Donald Hebb came up with a theory that when two neurons fire at the same time, the connection between them gets stronger. You might have heard the famous phrase, neurons that fire together, wire together. It was a revolutionary idea. And then, less than a decade later, Frank Rosenblatt took that exact theory and built it. He called his invention the perceptron.
And the parallel to biology is just striking. Look familiar? Just like a real neuron, the perceptron gets inputs, but instead of electrical signals, it gets data points. Then it adds them all up, but each input is multiplied by a weight, which is just a number that represents how strong that connection is. Finally, something called an activation function decides if the total sum is high enough to fire off its own signal. It is a direct mathematical copy of what happens in our brains.
But there was a problem. A really big one. The simple perceptron could only solve problems where you could separate the answers with a single straight line. It couldn't even handle a simple logic puzzle like the famous XOR problem, where one line just isn't enough to divide the right answers from the wrong ones. And for a while, this limitation basically stalled the entire field of AI. We had our artificial neuron, but we had no idea how to build a brain with it. So how did researchers get past this huge roadblock? Well, the answer once again was found by looking right back at the brain. It was time to stop thinking in lines and start thinking in layers. It was time to go deeper.
So we come back to this foundational quote from Donald Hebb. The real key wasn't just how one neuron learns, but how a whole network of them could learn together. I mean, your brain isn't a single flat sheet of cells, right? It's this deep, multi-layered organ where information gets processed in stages.
and AI needed to do the exact same thing. The massive breakthrough that finally unlocked these multi-layer networks was an algorithm called backpropagation. Here's the gist. After the network takes a guess at something, you calculate how wrong it was. Then, backpropagation sends that error signal backward through all the layers, telling each and every connection exactly how to adjust its own weight to be just a little bit less wrong the next time. It's this incredibly clever computational way of achieving synaptic plasticity across a whole deep network. And once we had this new ability to learn, well, things just took off. Researchers could now design all sorts of specialized networks that were inspired by specific parts of the brain, creating AI that could finally start to truly perceive and remember the world. So check this out. A Nobel Prize-winning discovery from the 60s draws a direct line to the AI that's probably in your phone right now. Scientists found that some neurons in an animal's visual cortex only fire when they see simple things, like a horizontal line or a specific angle. This discovery directly inspired what we now call convolutional neural networks, or CNNs. The first layers in a CNN learn to spot simple edges. The next layers combine those edges into shapes, and the deeper layers combine those shapes into complex objects like eyes, noses, and eventually a whole face. It is a direct copy of how your brain's visual system is structured. So, what about memory? Well, our brains process things in sequence, right? We use feedback loops to remember what just happened so we have context. This inspired recurrent neural networks, or RNNs, which are amazing for understanding things like language or speech. And even more advanced versions, called LSTMs, have these things called gates that let them decide what information is important enough to keep and what's okay to forget, which sounds a lot like our own selective memory, doesn't it? And that brings us to today and to the future. Because this relationship between neuroscience and AI, it isn't just a history lesson. It's a living, breathing partnership that's constantly evolving and shaping our world as we speak. Just look at this comparison, because this highlights the next great challenge. The power gap here is just staggering. Your brain, this incredible machine capable of art and science and love, runs on about 20 watts of power. That's a dim light bulb. The supercomputers we use to train AI models can use megawatts of power, enough to run a small town. When it comes to efficiency, nature is still winning, by a lot. So to close that insane efficiency gap, we are going right back to the original blueprint. This is fueling a whole new field called neuromorphic computing. And the goal here is no longer just to simulate the brain with software. The goal is to build the brain's principles right into the hardware itself, creating computer chips with artificial neurons and synapses that work with the same incredible efficiency as our own. And that leaves us with one final big idea to think about. This whole journey started with us trying to understand our own brains so we could build AI. But now it's a two-way street. We're using AI models to test theories about how our own minds work. So as we keep building these machines that mirror our own intelligence, the really fascinating question becomes, what do we end up learning about ourselves in the process?